From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Andras Simonyi, and I'm the managing director of the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins University. And it's my distinct pleasure to open this great event. Unfortunately, my friend and colleague, who is an American, he fell ill, but he's the real expert on the subject. So he asked me to stand in, and I, as a Hungarian, said, of course, we used to have a stake in this. Before I welcome the guests of honor and the distinguished speakers, let me just say, last year, with the support of Sasha Toporich, who is really the man behind all this, and who is a great Bosnian. I don't envy the real Bosnian ambassador in Washington because she's got competition. We went to an event in Sarajevo last year, and it was really fascinating. I hadn't been back in Sarajevo since my days as the ambassador to NATO. It was just right after the ceasefire, and I can't tell you how much impressed I was by the changes. And then friends of ours, Miriam, who is one of my colleagues, we went down to the bridge where the shooting happened. And we stood there, and all I was able to say is, Gavrilo, what have you done? What have you done? And for those who, I mean, you're all historians. You wouldn't be here otherwise. I was, of course, referring to Gavrilo Princip, who started this whole mess. And I have to say that as a Hungarian, I'm not a historian, I'm an economist, but trust me, even in my profession, the results of what he had done are felt to this day. And I must say that I come from a country that has suffered a trauma after the First World War, which is almost incomparable to the trauma suffered by others. And the terrible thing is it seems to me that Hungarians haven't gotten over it yet. And it's 100 years ago. But I'm not here to speak about Hungary. I'd like to greet Minister Trhulj, who is a frequent guest with the center, and gave a very important, very interesting lecture about Bosnia Herzegovina yesterday. Dr. Dorn, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by thanking the Library of Congress for hosting us here today. I am also very excited to read the Library of Congress publication, The First World War, to be published in 2016. This event would not be possible without the work and support of the America-Bosnia Foundation, our own center at SAIS, the European Division of the Library of Congress, the Canton of Sarajevo, the Federal Ministry of Culture and Sports, not your ministry, and many thanks for all of you for making this happen. We all know the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered the First World War, And we all think about the what-ifs. What would have happened if this didn't happen? How prosperous would Europe be? How undivided would Europe be today? We all think about the terrible mistakes the big powers made after the First World War. We can't but think about the role of the peace treaties after the First World War, which were smallish, which were heartless, and basically paved the way for Hitler, for anti-Semitism even, and paved the way for the Second World War. All these thoughts come to mind. I think, even if you're not a history buff, but you can't avoid doing a lot of reading, whether it's fine literature, whether it's history about the First World War. And I just want to say that in our profession, we deal with the transatlantic relations. It's extremely important that we understand how the happenings of the First World War are impacting our work still this day, today. I'd like to introduce our distinguished speakers. First, Jacques Klein, who served as United Nations Transitional Administrator for Eastern Slavonia, Baranja, and Western Sirmium from 96 to 98, with the rank of Undersecretary General. Jacques will not remember it, but that's the time we met when I was spending 24 hours a day with Bosnia. He was Principal Deputy High Representative for Bosnia-Herzegovina from 98 to 2001, United Nations Special Representative and Coordinator of UN Mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina from 2001 to 2003. Ambassador Klein was a career member of the Senior Foreign Service of the United States. He also served over 35 years in the United States Air Force, rising to the rank of Major General. Ambassador Klein has held lectureships and professorships at Princeton University, the Woodrow Wilson School, and the International University of Dubrovnik. He is a graduate of the Roosevelt University, which conferred on him an honorary degree of Doctor of Humane Letters. Gerard Toal, to my left, is Professor of Government and International Affairs at Virginia Tech's National Capital Region campus in Alexandria, where he directs the Government and International Affairs program. He has a PhD in political geography from Maxwell School at Syracuse University, and is one of the founding figures in establishing critical geopolitics as a domain of research within political geography and international relations. His most recent book, Bosnia Remade, Ethnic Cleansing and Its Reversal, won the 2012 Julian Mingy Outstanding Research Award in the Political Geography Specialty Group of the Association of American Geographers, and was shortlisted for the 2012 Joseph Rothschild Prize in Nationalism and Ethnic Studies. Dr. Toal has held fellowships at the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute and the Center for International Studies at the University of Southern California. In 2005, he testified before the United States Congress on political developments in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Professor Toal is a native of County Monaghan in, is that the right way to say it?
Close enough.
In the Republic of Ireland. And last but not least, Paul Miller did his PhD in modern European history at Yale. In '95, his dissertation, From Revolutionaries to Citizens, Anti-Militarism in France, 1870-1914, was published by Duke University Press in 2002. Since '98, Dr. Miller has taught at McDaniel College in the US in 2000. I've been there. I'm just telling you.
Maybe we'll have you back.
2004 and 2005, he was a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Sarajevo, where he wrote on genocide memory in Bosnia and taught a course on contemporary genocide. From 2011 to 13, Dr. Miller was a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Birmingham. That's in the UK. It's still called the UK. Where he worked. I thought that was funny. I'm sorry about that. No Scots here, are there? Anybody from Scotland? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm making a big mistake here. Like the Queen did 2 days ago. Where he worked on a book on memory of Sarajevo. That's what Gavrilo Princip did to Europe, I'm telling you. Sarajevo assassination, tentatively entitled June 28, 1914. A Day in History and Memory. Miller's article on Yugoslav memory of the assassination, Yugoslav Eulogies, The Footprints of Gavrilo Princip, was recently published in the Karl Beck Papers in Russian and East European Studies. Now, I'd like to just explain to you how we're going to run this event, and then we'll go over to the speakers. First, we've asked our speakers to consider the centennial of the Sarajevo assassination, the long-lasting ramifications of that event, and the contextualization of the Balkans 100 years later. Of course, within these broad parameters, each panelist will concentrate on specific aspects of the theme which is closest to their heart. Professor Miller will lead off with an analysis of events in Bosnia and Herzegovina surrounding the following of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie Jacques, Duchess of Hohenberg. Ambassador Klein will follow with a discussion of the impact of World War I on civilians, using his own family history as an example. And then finally, Professor Toal will wrap up the presentations with a consideration of continuity and change. How the countries of the Western Balkans today are influenced by the events of June 28, 1914. Each panelist will speak for 10 to 15 minutes. I hope that in the course of the debate, we will flesh out the consequences for today. But without further ado, I'd like to call upon Georgette, who's a Hungarian. Hungarians run the Library of Congress, as I can see. Okay, that's just a joke. I must say that I haven't seen Georgette for a long time, but when I was the Hungarian ambassador to the United States many years ago, we used to do some fun things together. So Georgette, thank you very much. Nagyon örülök, hogy látom, és parancsolja.
I want to welcome you all in the name of the Library of Congress, and I'm sorry that Ambassador Jadranka Negodic has been detained at the State Department. She'll be with us later. And the Minister, Erdal Trhulj, will say a few words. But in the name of the Library of Congress, I want to say that we have a very nice Bosnian collection. We have 7,500 books published in Bosnia and about 2,000 published in other languages. We also have book dealers in Sarajevo that send us important books that we select for the collections. Many others come by exchange and gift. We have a very important exchange program with the Academy of Sciences and Arts in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The curator of our South Slavic collection is Angela Cannon. Thank you very much. And I give you Andras Simonyi, who did a much better job than I.
I disagree. Minister, can I call upon you to make a few comments?
Thank you.
Please.
Dear hosts, dear friends, it gives me great pleasure to address you at the opening such an illustrious event. I would like to thank our hosts at the Library of the Congress and at the Center for Transatlantic Relations SAIS for arranging this event, which will give us opportunity for discussion on the First World War and its consequences through the 20th and 21st centuries. From the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the spark of ignited Europe, the First World War, brought death and devastation across the continent. On the spot in Sarajevo, from which Governor Princip fired his deadly shots, a sign proclaims in the street corner that started the 20th century. Indeed, the war brought a level of chaos to the world that had never been seen, a kind of madness that would sadly be repeated through the 20th century. The United States played a crucial role in ending the First World War, and the sacrifice of American lives in the war to end all wars should never be forgotten. Americans' willingness to stand for the values of freedom and democracy was forever sealed in the minds and hearts of people worldwide, and the United States lent a decisive hand to the Allied victory in the Second World War. The unprecedented landing at Normandy 70 years ago, and the tens of thousands of Americans buried on European soil who fell fighting for free the old continent from the forces of darkness, stands alone as an inspiration to all of us striving to build free, open, and democratic society. The United States came yet again in the Balkan Wars in the 90s in defense of life, freedom, and dignity of peoples in the former Yugoslavia. We, people and citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, are thankful for your role in bringing lasting peace in our country. Maybe this event in this famous library in the world be further inspiration to remember our past, so we may work together toward a better future. Looking the esteemed names of today's moderator and panelists, I'm sure they will be very inspiring for thoughtful debate, and maybe today we will come to the answer where we are 100 years after from the corner where the started 20th century, and what is the road we are going last 100 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Professor Miller?
Okay, great, thank you. And first of all, let me just thank the organizers at SAIS and the Library of Congress for having me here. It's just a tremendous honor to be at this event. And also the Bosnian sponsors, of course, for the privilege to perhaps say some controversial things about their country, which I've done quite a lot of in the last number of years. As the lead-off speaker, the only historian on the panel, I was given the straightforward task of discussing events in Bosnia and Herzegovina before and after the Sarajevo assassination in 15 minutes. Well, it's a small country, and I read that sentence several times, and I thought to myself, well, what in fact was this Sarajevo assassination, and why is it called the Sarajevo assassination? After all, we don't talk about the Dallas assassination or the Memphis assassination, right? We talk about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King. There's no other assassination I can think of we talk about in terms of where it happened. Who was this forgettable Franz Ferdinand, then, besides the indie rock band Franz Ferdinand? After all, he happened to live for more than 50 years prior to getting killed on June 28, 1914 in Sarajevo. What kind of person was he? What was his politics? What were his politics? Why was he targeted for political assassination by some very young men from Bosnia and Herzegovina? And then finally, and most relevant to this panel, what can his assassination and how it's understood in Bosnia and Herzegovina today inform us, tell us in terms of the country's 20th century? After all, the World War and the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, after the World War and the collapse of the empire, Bosnia became part of an independent South Slavic state, Yugoslavia. That was the aim of the assassins, and many other Bosnians as well, though by no means all Bosnians. That state no longer exists, but for many years during which it did, many Yugoslavists constructed the assassination as a positive act of resistance against a hegemonic colonial regime, since they alleged it had brought about the country's liberation, even if in a rather indirect and ruthless way, the First World War. So if we start with the question, why is it that we refer to the Sarajevo assassination by the name of where it took place, the capital of Bosnia, where it occurred, rather than the name of its victim? Like most assassinations, well, there's no clear answer. I'm not going to offer one, other than I'd like to suggest that there is something different about this assassination, and that, of course, is that of the many political assassinations that took place, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, including an American president by an anarchist in 1901, this one is directly attached to a world war. It's this irony, it's this disproportionality. This guy named Franz Ferdinand, who we know very little about, most people, including myself when I started my work, certainly had these apocalyptic kinds of consequences. In response to that, one writer, an American travel writer in the 1930s, sort of did a humph and said, quote, "It is an intolerable affront to human and political nature that these wretched and unhappy little countries in the Balkan Peninsula have quarrels that cause world wars. Some 150,000 young Americans died because of an event in 1914 in a mud-caked primitive village, Sarajevo." That's a pretty well-known quote by now, but lest you think that it's just of its time, the interwar period, let me quote the Oxford University historian Margaret Macmillan a few months ago in the New York Times. The Sarajevo assassination is referred to as, quote, "a random event in an Austro-Hungarian backwater," end quote. So here's where we'll start, since that was my task to talk about Bosnia. With this wretched, unhappy little country in the Balkan Peninsula, this Austro-Hungarian backwater, this world war causing Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was once again at the center of international attention at the end of the century, as we all know as well. Was it a backwater? Bosnia and Herzegovina may have been one of Europe's poorest regions, despite more than 30 years of Austro-Hungarian administration, beginning in 1878. But it was definitely no backwater, particularly in a geopolitical sense. If it were, then it would not have been visited by both the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Franz Joseph, and his nephew and heir, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in the space of 4 years. The emperor went in 1910. His nephew, the Archduke, went in 1914. Nor would its annexation by Austria-Hungary in 1908 have led to a 6-month-long diplomatic crisis that brought Europe's great powers to the very brink of war. So why all this fuss over one of Europe's least developed regions? Well, the starting point in this history lesson, so to speak, is the so-called Eastern Question. In other words, the gradual decline of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans and the instability that such power vacuums invariably create. What would become of the European domains of the empire? That is, the Bulgarian, Greek, Macedonian, Montenegrin, Albanian, Serbian, Romanian, and, of course, Bosnian remnants. Secondly, there's geography. The Balkans as a kind of land bridge towards Asia. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway project was underway. Of course, Russia's long-term ambitions for a warm water port and control of the straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits, to get into the Mediterranean. But for Bosnia, this goes back, and I think that the place to start, because when you talk about the predecessors of all this, how far back do we have to go to the alleged Bogomils of Bosnia and the medieval church debate? I mean, one really has to think about this. But for Bosnia, a good place to start, I think, is 1875 to 1878, the so-called Great Eastern Crisis, which was a series of uprisings against the Ottoman Turks that began in eastern Bosnia. Now, it then spread to Serbia, it spread to Bulgaria, it brought the Russians into a war, but it began exactly in the area that Gavrilo Princip lived and grew up, and all of his predecessors took part in it. And the most important outcome of this Great Eastern Crisis is that it Europeanized the Bosnian question. In 1878, you had the Congress of Berlin. It was convened by the most important political leader probably in Europe, perhaps the world at the time, Otto von Bismarck, and they sat around in Berlin and they drank sherry and they looked at maps and places that nobody could pronounce, right? Hard to understand how that makes Bosnia a backwater. The outcome of the Berlin Congress was many things, but to be quick here, completely independent Serbia. Serbia had basically won its own independence earlier in the 19th century, but now it was completely independent and in a few years would be recognized as a kingdom. Secondly, of course, for our purposes, all of you realize this, Bosnia and Herzegovina is put under Austro-Hungarian administration. It's still nominally part of the Ottoman Empire under the Sultan. Well, why would Austria-Hungary want Bosnia? And by the way, the Hungarians adamantly did not. They didn't want to bring more Slavs into the empire. They felt they had enough on their hands as well. This poor, pre-modern, virtually totally undeveloped, over 90% illiteracy, no industry or infrastructure, largely peasant with feudalistic system with an exploitative land-owning class. Well, it was a region that had minerals. It was the geopolitical significance that mattered above all. When it came to Bosnia, the place that Vienna, the one place that reason for having Bosnia that Vienna and Budapest could agree upon was in keeping it out of the hands of this new and upcoming independent Serbian state. And the Serbian state saw itself as the kind of Prussia in the German sense of unification, or Piedmont, as one of their journals was called, in the Italian sense of unification. It was going to be the hinge, the focal point, the fulcrum, I should say, that was going to unite all of the South Slavs into one greater Serbian state, or if you were a Yugoslavist in the Habsburg monarchy, a South Slav, a Croat, a Bosnian Muslim, a Bosnian Serb, a Serbian Croat, etc., then it was a Yugoslavist, more of a Yugoslavist vision than a greater Serbian vision, but in many ways they amounted to similar things in terms of the creation of a state. So this is the big question then for the multinational Austro-Hungarian Empire. In this age that a country like Serbia, which was rather undeveloped itself but had big visions and plans to be the fulcrum of this greater South Slavic state, saw Austria-Hungary as sort of next on the list. After the Ottoman Empire collapse, Austria-Hungary, with its 11 recognized nationalities, would be sort of next in line. It was part of the past, right? And so this brings us to Franz Ferdinand, who I'd love to talk about at length. He's a fascinating individual. But the counterfactual question was already mentioned in the introduction, the counterfactual what-if question. Would he be, when he came to power, which he never did, of course, the person who was able to introduce political reforms that would appease the various nationalities, not just the South Slavs? They weren't the only ones who had their grievances and wanted more political autonomy and rights for their people. And he knew political reforms were necessary, or was he just so autocratic and overbearing in his personality, which has some interesting roots, psychological roots that I won't have time to go into, that he would have been the so-called grave digger of this empire? Well, one thing I do want to mention, and that's because the question of the motivation of the Sarajevo assassination, is that while Franz Ferdinand had a difficult personality and could be a kind of uptight and suspicious person, he believed strongly in the monarchy. He was highly politically skilled. This is the consensus of most historians writing now, including Almahaneg's new biography. He was highly politically skilled. He was very involved in daily political life in the monarchy, and he had a vision, and his vision was no war. We need to first stabilize the monarchy, and if we go to war with Russia in particular, that's going to be the end of our empire and their empire. And he said that many times. So many historians have pointed out the irony that it's his death. With his death, you lose the one person in Vienna who would have spoken out firmly against war. So there's the interesting counterfactual question about Franz Ferdinand as well. Of course, there's lots of counterfactual questions. He was practically on his deathbed with tuberculosis in the 1890s. His uncle was on his deathbed in April 1914, but somehow pulled through. All of these are counterfactual questions that take place before Gavrilo Princip ever pulls the trigger. So counterfactual questions are an interesting exercise, but they go on ad infinitum. So this brings us to why he's targeted. So we have the annexation of Bosnia in 1908. In 1910, when things settle down after the annexation crisis, the Kaiser, Franz Joseph, goes to Bosnia, official visit, stalked by an assassin. Nothing happens, obviously. Two Balkan Wars, 1912, 1913, the Ottoman Empire is further pushed out. Serbia doubles in size, becoming a greater threat. And then we get to 1914 and Franz Ferdinand's trip to Bosnia to observe military maneuvers. There was no military purpose beyond observing maneuvers whatsoever. Some people thought that at the time, but there's no evidence whatsoever of it. The plotters themselves were all Bosnians. They were not all Bosnian Serbs. One of the 7 in the line was a Bosnian Muslim. You might say the 20th century began with a Christian, the 24th Christian suicide assassin, the 21st. In any case, the first the one in line, Mohamed Mehmed Basic, did not act, but they were all Bosnians. Some had been studying in Belgrade, hanging out in cafes, and they were part of a loose, completely non-hierarchical organization, unorganized organization called Young Bosnia, Mlada Bosna, right? They did not have one ideological perspective. Some were socialists, some were anarchists, some were Yugoslavists. They were all smart young men. They read a lot. They discussed ideas, okay? They got their weapons from a conspiratorial group in Serbia called Unification or Death, sometimes known as the Black Hand. A group of army officers whose newspaper was called Piedmont after the Italian state that was the linchpin for the unification of Italy. Well, why did they want to kill him? Now, there's a question, who initiated the assassination? And I'd be happy to talk about that in discussion if we have time, but this is not the place for it here based on what I was told, I was tasked to talk about. The important question is, why did they want to kill Franz Ferdinand? And this question has to do with Austro-Hungarian rule during its first 30-plus years in Bosnia prior to 1914. And this is a fascinating debate, and it's a debate that I think you can make the argument on either side that Austria-Hungary was a ruthless colonial power that looked down its nose at these so-called primitive Bosnians and was going to bring them up. It was sort of the Austro-Hungarian burden, so to speak. It was going to bring them up into a better society, and this was a terrible humiliation for many Bosnians. On the other hand, they built hundreds of schools. They brought industry. People immigrated. The economy flourished. You got a parliament in 1910. There was the development of a Bosnian Serb middle class, urban middle class, which was very significant because most of the Bosnian Serbs were peasants. So this is the debate. But the point of all this, I mean, the city hall that Franz Ferdinand's visits was built by the Austrians, the tramway line in Sarajevo, et cetera, et cetera. So the point of this is that if there's no consensus today amongst historians as to whether it was good or bad, and we really have to look at both sides, back then there were people who also saw both sides, the advantages of being part of this large empire and the advantages of acting, agitating for liberation, however, whatever form that agitation may have taken place, not necessarily through violence. The assassination itself, I've said, is carried out by these young Bosnians who do choose violence. And they're all quite young. Princip is 19 years old, though that's not uncommon when it comes to such acts in all of world history. Why did it lead to the European War? Especially if Bosnia and Herzegovina was such a backwater, as Margaret Macmillan again tells us in the New York Times. Global panic and stock market sell-offs did not follow the news of the assassination. Despite numerous analogies you read today to 9/11, and I would love to talk about the analogies constantly being made in the press today to contemporary terrorism, Sarajevo was more like a sad headline than a heart-stopping preview of the upcoming era. The assassination may have stirred sober concern from Lord Grantham in Downton Abbey, but most Englishmen had the reaction of Basil Thompson, a British intelligence officer, and I quote, "Like most Englishmen, I read of the murder at Sarajevo without a thought that it was to react upon the destiny of this country. It seemed to be an ordinary case of Balkan manners, out of which would proceed diplomatic correspondence, an arrest or two, and a trial imperfectly reported in our newspapers." Well, a better quotation would be the British Undersecretary of State, Sir Arthur Nicholson, in a letter he wrote to his ambassador in St. Petersburg. "The tragedy which has just taken place in Sarajevo will not, I trust, lead to further complications," end quote. All right, now you can find evidence of people, higher-ups generally, who were very worried right away But Europeans, Germans who were vacationing in the south of France and British who were vacationing in Vienna did not go running home until after the ultimatum was sent on July 23rd. The July crisis doesn't really begin until July 23rd. Well, so the Serbian reaction to the assassination is generally positive, but in Bosnia, and this is significant for our topic, there is an outbreak of outright violence against Serbs throughout Bosnia, not only in Sarajevo. Massive property damage. There are pictures of this, actually. Even killings and hangings of Serbs. In fact, some scholars have pointed out that this violence that took place following the Sarajevo assassination against Serbs, Bosnian Serbs, represented something relatively new in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the first large-scale outburst of purely inter-ethno-religious, whatever you want to call it, national hatred. In other words, their argument is that since Bosnian brutality prior to 1914 was commonly of the economic or anti-imperialistic sort, the inflamed anti-Serb feelings set loose by the assassination were obviously not going to be easily buried when the assassins themselves were buried. And that leads to the question, how do we get from this disunity to Bosnia's and the other former Habsburg crown lands, Croatia, Slovenia, etc., integration after World War I, 4 years after this assassination, into the Kingdom of Yugoslavia? After all, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, and Bosnians of all ethno-religious backgrounds fought in the vengeful Austro-Hungarian armies that devastated Belgrade and then slashed, burned, and raped their way through the rest of Serbia. Forging political unity at times during World War I appeared pointless, if not impossible. How did it come about? Well, as I've indicated, there was a cultural Yugoslavist movement that did gain strength during the war. That's relevant. The straightforward answer is the same one you give students with the Bolshevik Revolution. It happens in the context of the World War and the changes that take place during the war itself. The survival of the Serbian army, the eventual, though by no means inevitable, defeat and collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the world. So on a purely political plane, and I like to consider culture as well, the new South Slavic state was principally a product of wartime exigency. Okay? The Austro-Hungarian Yugoslavists and Serbian nationalist leaders had all, how long?
You're done.
We're done? Oh, okay.
Well, just finish your thought.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was...
Don't worry.
How long have I been?
You're 20 minutes.
20 minutes in. Okay, well, this is actually my conclusion. So if I can do my conclusion, I'll...
Yes, please.
Yes. Well, I have to give a conclusion by as an historian. So the question then, again, how do we get to this Bosnian state and this Yugoslavia that no longer existed? It's easy, as you said in the introductory remarks, to blame the Sarajevo assassination for everything. I wouldn't do that. I've recently published an article on how the assassination has been remembered in the two Yugoslavias and the former Yugoslavia today. And on the one hand, the findings are obvious. Serbs think of him, the assassin, as a great hero. They build statues to him. And Muslims and Croats see him as a terrorist and use that term today. On the other hand, there's the World War, which did not follow any other major political assassinations. In other words, the context for grappling with the legacy of 1914 is far broader than Bosnia alone. Of course, there may have been different paths in history. It's irresponsible to assume that World War I was somehow inevitable with or without Sarajevo, thus arguing, as many Bosnian Croats and Bosniaks do today, that the Serb Princip halted Bosnia's movement towards its path towards Europe is nationalist propaganda, no less than that. At the same time, the praise of Princip as this great liberator is also nationalist propaganda. I would suggest that we go back to 1914 rather than focus on 1941 to 45 or 92 to 95, that this would be a better starting point for grappling with the unreconciled past in Bosnia. As at that moment, there were Bosnians of all ethno-religious backgrounds who supported and even worked towards their country's further integration into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By the same token, there were the far better known Bosnians who worked for liberation for that empire. These were both admirable positions. These were by no means incompatible positions. What followed with the assassination and the war, not to mention the rest of the 20th century, was a tragedy for Bosnians of all backgrounds, regardless of those political visions. But it was also a European and even a global tragedy, one whose ramifications we're still working through. The fact that the Bosnians were able to join a South Slavic state after the war, only later to see it bloodily torn apart, first time from outside, in less than 1 century, is just one further element of the World War's wasteful legacy. And yet, despite the rhetoric and the name, the Sarajevo assassination, this global tragedy was not made in Sarajevo, or even in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where agitation for greater political independence was little different from that in other parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The formative tragedy of the 20th century, the First World War, was made in Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Paris, and London. And nobody ever called those places primitive, mud-caked backwaters. Thanks. Sorry.
All right, thank you.
When the war began, obviously the Prussian Empire drafted a lot of young Alsatians. Both my grandfathers were in the German army. My oldest uncle, Eugene, was in the German army and fought at Tannenberg and received an Iron Cross. My other uncle, Emil, fought on the Western Front, and a bunker caved in on them, and because of oxygen deprivation, he never recovered, even in the 1950s. Those are the long-term consequences of what war brings. Now, you can imagine then in the 1920s, if you're sitting around a table in our little village, you have my grandfather, who was in the German army, the oldest brother, who was in the German army, my father, who had been in the French Medical Corps, and my other uncle Joseph, who had been a chasseur alpin, the French Alpine mountain troops, and the dialogue that goes on in a context like this. One of the only positive results of this Prussian rule was that, as you know, in 1904, 1905, France went through a very anti-clerical period where they closed all the religious institutions, Jesuits and others were driven out. The Alsatians, when we became French again, were somewhat revolted by this and actually resisted Paris. And so if you find in France today that if you go to Alsace, the priest, the minister, and the rabbi becomes the fonctionnaire d'etat, an administrator of the state, and receives a pension and a salary from the French government every month, even though this is a religious phenomenon. In 1940, when the Germans returned, and they once again annexed Alsace, on the 15th of June, they crossed the border. They immediately expelled 45,000 people as political undesirables. They passed legislation. French nationals, Alsatians identified as pro-French, also deemed politically unreliable, were expelled. Additionally, thousands of other Alsatians who'd volunteered at World War I were also put upon and sent to Struthof concentration camp and Schermbeck-Vollbruck. The process of Germanization, that is the names of towns, what the Germans call Namensänderung, began immediately. Towns and villages received new names overnight. Cernay became Senheim, Chalon became Eichwald, Dannemarie became Dannenkirch, etc., etc. And our village, Saint Hippolyte, became Saint Bilt. All names were changed. Armand became Hermann, Roger became Rudiger, Etienne became Stefan, Jean became Hans, etc., etc. The use of the French language and all French words that had been assimilated into the Alsatian dialect were forbidden. All street signs, store names, restaurants, etc., etc., were changed. There was quite a bit of resistance among young Alsatians. All the heroes of the Napoleonic period, General Rapp, Kleber, Victor, all the others, there are 28 Alsatian generals on the Arc de Triomphe. These graves were exhumed, statues were moved, public library, French books were burned, and in December 1941 it was decreed that the beret could no longer be worn, mandatory 6-week jail sentence. Participation in German labor service began immediately. All young males between 17 and 25 were called up. The Gauleiter Robert Wagner, for an act which he was condemned and we ultimately executed him, all Alsatian Jews who had not been expelled were expelled. Young men who had already done military service in the French army, 37, 38, 39, and were demobilized and had come home, were now again drafted into the Wehrmacht and sent out to the Eastern Front. In fact, Wagner had the sobriquet Schlachter von Elsass, the butcher of Alsace. And what he was condemned for was systematic recruitment of French citizens from Alsace to serve against France, killing Allied prisoners of wars, mass execution of deportees. One year group after the other was called up. Now, repeated Nazi attempts to engage voluntary recruitment didn't work very well. Obergruppenführer Gottlob Bergen, chief of staff of the military SS, who didn't die till the 1950s after collecting his pension for a number of years, vented his frustration in a telegram to Himmler on 21 June 1944, quote, "Alsatians are, with all due respect, a bunch of bastards. They already believe the French and English will return, and in the last few days have increasingly shown a particularly hostile and hateful attitude." In our own family, my Uncle Joseph, and you have to understand, someone who can be culturally very German, Goethe, Heine, Schiller, Moike, Lenau, Brahms, Beethoven, Bach, etc., very German culturally, but hated Prussian aristocracy, Prussian autocracy. And he had been studying in Germany, and when the war began, he saw it coming, obviously, in the summer. He left by way of Switzerland and entered France, and immediately went to the recruiting depot and said, "I want to join up." And, as you can imagine, was arrested as an enemy alien. After trying to explain to him that we thought one of the functions of this war was to liberate Alsace from Prussian rule, and they finally agreed and said, fine. And so his regiment of 1,200 went off. By the end of the war, there were 340 or so left. He was highly decorated, Croix de Médaille Militaire, Légion d'honneur, etc. Came back to Celestat, where I was born, opened his business, had 2 girls, one of whom became my godmother. And in 1940, when the Nazis showed up, first name on the list, Joseph Lorpère, volontaire, engagé volontaire, Première Guerre mondiale, volunteer, First World War, concentration camp, Struthof. Now, what saved him, as it turns out, since they had called up a lot of other people, my Uncle Eugene was also conscripted in early 43 and sent off to the Russian front, where he subsequently disappeared. We don't know what happened to him. All we know that one of his colleagues said they were refueling, reloading, artillery fire commenced, the whole thing went up in smoke, and that's the last of they saw Eugene. But the fact that he was on the Eastern Front, my godmother, who was president of the Alsatian Red Cross, could go to the Gauleiter Wagner and say, listen, Monsieur Lorpère may have committed a youthful indiscretion by volunteering for the French army, but do remember, his brother-in-law is in Russia, and so are 2 nephews, and it would be very unseemly if anything happened to Monsieur Lorpère in this camp. As you know, Struthof is the only concentration camp in France up in the Vosges. 1943 was not a good year for us. André-Joseph Klein was killed in October in Nikopol, Russia. August Eugene Klein was killed July 13th, 44, in Elzerau in Poland. My cousin Charles was luckier. He was a little younger. He was conscripted and, oddly enough, posted to Italy, because the German rule was all Alsatians are to be sent to the Eastern Front and let the Russians grind them up. In any case, as soon as he got to Italy, he and 2 other Alsatians deserted, joined the Italian partisans, fought with the Italians, but were betrayed. Court-martialed, sentenced to death, sent to Mauthausen concentration camp outside of Vienna. But fortunately, as he said, there are some decent people. There was an old Austrian captain there who basically said, you know, Jungs, they were 17 and a half, 18 years old. Lay low, the war will be over soon, and with some luck, you'll survive. My godfather, Emil, was also called up, and after basic training was sent by way of Passelwalk through Czechia, through Hungary, through Romania, out to somewhere near Odessa. And there their unit was overrun by the Russians, and he was sent to a POW camp called Tambov, T-A-M-B-O-W, which is 480 kilometers south of Moscow. In that camp were thousands of young Alsatians, because the Russians are very good at propaganda, and I've seen all their leaflets that they put out, the loudspeakers that they had on the Eastern Front. We know you were drafted against your will. We know you don't want to be here. Here's the leaflet. Give yourself up. You'll be treated humanely. And he just said it was so bizarre because after being interrogated and debriefed and what have you, he was given a train ticket with 2 other POWs. They had POW uniforms on, obviously, and said, you go to Tambov. And they went by train to Tambov. Now, Tambov, after he got there, they quickly organized themselves. They grew their own vegetables because people were dying like flies, you can imagine, every day, dysentery, cholera, you name it, it existed. And what they did, they trained about 1,500 of them to be ready to move if they had to move and go somewhere. And at that point, General de Gaulle was in London. Obviously, General Koenig was the chief of staff. And Koenig said, you know, your French have sold us out twice now. In 1870, to avoid paying indemnity, you gave up Alsace because you didn't want Prussian occupation. In 1940, under Vichy, you did the same thing. You never protested once when the Alsatians were called up for military service in the German army. You need to do something. And de Gaulle said, yes, you're right, go to Moscow. Talk to the Russians, see what they say. And he went, they met Voroshilov and all the senior leadership. And basically the Russians said, look, we understand the situation. Any of these people you have down here who are fit to travel, we'll let go. So General Petit and 7 French liaison officers went to Tambov, and there were 1,500 of them, physically fit. So they took them down to, first of all, to Tehran, deloused them, fed them, then put them in trucks, and then they went by way of basically Baghdad, all the way to Haifa. Haifa, they put them on ships, they sent them back to North Africa, and they landed in Algeria. Now they're back in French control, food, training, new uniforms. And then, as Emil told me, he said, we were told that there was an American general was coming, and we were going to have a parade. So we were all on the parade ground. The American general came, he got up on the platform, and through a very good interpreter, he said, boys, are you ready to fight the Nazis? Oui, mon général. He said, you boys look awful young to me. Do any of you have any military experience? Oui, mon général. 2 ans avec l'armée française. 1 an en Russie avec la Wehrmacht. 2 years in the French army, and a year plus in Russia, in the Wehrmacht. He said, holy Christ, how the hell can you be in the French and German army in the same war? But that is the reality of the European situation. In any case, they landed at Toulon, as you know, came up through France, liberated Berchtesgaden. But Tambov is valuable for us as Alsatians because Tambov has the largest military cemetery outside of France. 10,000 young Alsatians are buried there, all in a war they wanted no part of, being forcefully drafted to fight in an area they never wanted to fight in. Now, those are, in a sense, the ramifications, the vicissitudes of World War I that never ended. And indeed, I remember my grandmother and I were in a town called Mosheim, near Strasbourg in the Vosges, and we were on a train platform. And my grandmother had forgotten one thing, which I mentioned to you earlier. The wearing of the beret was forbidden because it was considered pro-French. And as I was standing there, I think I was 5, maybe 5 and a half, I felt a hand reach from behind me and whack me very, very hard, to the point where I flew off the platform and landed on the railroad tracks. And it was an SS man who obviously resented my wearing a beret, because obviously as a 5-year-old, I was a real threat to Nazism. My grandmother and 2 other older ladies took their umbrellas and literally started to beat the crap out of him, as I found out later on. And then the German military police came and took him away because they didn't want to have a riot on this railroad station in eastern France in the fall of 1944 when they were already losing the war. So the vicissitudes of history are all there. My father died, obviously, early on, but my mother remarried to a gentleman and was married to him for 30 years. He had the unique opportunity of fighting in Macedonia in World War I. As you remember, after the Serbs left and went to Corfu, they were retrained by the French and British, came back to Thessaloniki under Marshal Franchet d'Espèrey, and re-landed and fought their way back inland. Now, the reason I mention him, he passed away in the mid-'80s. Every year, at least once or twice, he would have a malarial typhus attack, the result of World War I, which he never got over, which obviously was still in the blood system somewhere. So the legacy was there. And then the last time I saw my Uncle Emil, the one who had been in the bunker that caved in and oxygen deprivation, etc., my aunt and I were walking down the street, and he came walking toward us. And my aunt said, Emil, come here. She said, this is Jacques. This is Josephine's boy. And this is now 40 years after World War I. And he could just, oh, Jacques, that's you, never recovered. Now, millions never recovered. As you know, in France, if you've ridden the metro or any train, there's a little seat there reserved for mutilés de guerre, those injured in the war. Now, fortunately, when you're civilized, you sort these things out. So all the Alsatians who fought in the German army in World War I were picked up in the French Social Security system. And the same thing happened in World War II, because we lost a lot of people. So at least at some level, there's reconciliation. The most positive thing, I think, was when I saw Mitterrand and Kohl at Verdun with Ernst Junger, if you remember Ernst Junger, hero of World War I, pour la mérite, and highly decorated novelist, etc. And Junger was there, actually, at Verdun as well. And Kohl and Mitterrand, as they were standing there, said, look, what did this? Nationalism, imperialism, capitalism, stupidity, illogic, what did it? But whatever it is, let's make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Thank you, Jacques. This was excellent. Thank you.
So, in his 1994 book, The Age of Extremes, the British historian Eric Hobsbawm outlines what he terms the short 20th century, the one from 1914 to 1991 that begins and ends in Sarajevo. Princep's assassination launched the geopolitical rivalries of the period into a fatal spiral that ended with the disaster of World War I and the overthrow of the then European order. Now, the end of 1991 saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the 25th of December resignation of Mikhail Gorbachev as president of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The office that he held was declared extinct and all of the powers were ceded to Russia's President Yeltsin. A geopolitical superpower in a system that had held Europe in its grip for over 40 years fell apart. But as we know, the transition to the new era, the post-Cold War era, proved to be intensely violent for Bosnia-Herzegovina. In late November 1991, the International Conference on Yugoslavia formed a commission of prominent lawyers to provide legal advice regarding the status of Yugoslavia. The president of the French Constitutional Court, Robert Badinter, led the commission. It soon concluded that Yugoslavia was in the process of dissolution and that any future Yugoslav union could only come from the alignment of independent republics that desired to integrate. Furthermore, the Commission determined that inter-republican boundaries should be deemed as borders subject to international law and that they were changeable only by agreement of all sides, the legal doctrine which is known as uti possidetis. Now, this placed the leading party representing Serbs in Bosnia, the Serb Democratic Party, a party that led a withdrawal from the socialist Bosnian parliament in protest at the possibility of a sovereign and independent Bosnia. It placed that party in a serious bind. Their preference was that Bosnia should remain within Yugoslavia, but it was no longer legally possible in the eyes of the European community and the international community writ large. Rather, Bosnia would have to create a new union with Serbia or a third Yugoslavia led by it, and this would occur only with the consent of other major actors in Bosnia. Meanwhile, German officials had announced their intention to recognize the independence of Slovenia and Croatia by Christmas and were intensely lobbying other European community members to join them. Great Britain, Greece, and the United States expressed concern that such a decision would aggravate the situation. And on the December 17th, the European community reached a compromise resolution establishing a December 23rd deadline for submitting a petition for independence for the former socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, those republics that desired it. And having only a week to decide, the Bosnian presidency submitted a petition on behalf of Bosnia on the 20th of December 1991. Now, only 2 months earlier, the Bosnian president, Ali Izetbegovic, had stated that his party would probably not pursue independence without SDS approval. And in early January of 1992, he proclaimed that the presidency, quote, didn't want to rush with demands for recognition, but the European community was moving ahead of us in that regard, end quote. So immediately after the presidency's decision to petition for independence, the SDS-led Serb Assembly decided to unite the ethno-territorial units that had been created that year, the Serb autonomous oblasts, into a Republic of Serb Bosnia-Herzegovina. The institutions of this RSBIH were intended to exist parallel to those of the socialist Bosnia until resolution of the crisis. And on the 9th of January 1992, Radovan Karadzic publicly declared the foundation of the RSBIH, the date chosen to preempt possible immediate recognition of Bosnia by the European Union the next day. The territorial breakup of the Socialist Republic of Bosnia had begun. Now, the legacy of that fatal territorial fragmentation the legacy was visible in how the different parts of Bosnia chose to commemorate the centenary of the Archduke Ferdinand's assassination. First, there was no joint commemoration, but rival ceremonies and spectacles. As was widely reported in the media here and elsewhere, the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra played a concert in the historic and recently restored Sarajevo National Library. There was a conference, a special exhibition at the chronically underfunded National Historical Museum of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Meanwhile, in Visegrad, in the theme park, the movie studio created by Emir Kusturica called Andrićgrad, the RS put on its commemoration, which could be described as more of a celebration of the assassination. In his speech, RS President Milorad Dodik declared that, quote, the shots fired 100 years ago by Gavrilo Princip were not fired at Europe. They were shots for freedom, marking the start of the Serbs' fight for liberation from foreign occupiers, end quote. New East Sarajevo named a park after Princip and erected a large statue of him overlooking a children's playground. We are connecting history of which we are very proud, with the future, our children, said the mayor. Now, the arc of history from Sarajevo 1914 to Sarajevo 1991 through to Sarajevo 2014 is long, and whether or not it bends towards justice, it certainly has been buffeted by serious geopolitical turbulence and politico-geographic change down the years. The wars of the Yugoslav dissolution ended with the Kosovo War of 1999, and in 2008, its Euro-Atlantic supported government unilaterally declared its independence. And later that year, the NATO's Bucharest Declaration of April 2008 declared that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become members of the alliance. And both of these events propelled Russia into a more assertive policy towards the geostrategic parts of its near abroad, beginning in the Caucasus. After the outbreak of war in August 2008 over Georgia's military moves in South Ossetia, the Russian Federation recognized the breakaway territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. And as we know, the overthrow of the democratically elected kleptocrat in Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, provoked a stealthy Russian invasion of Crimea and a hastily sponsored referendum that created supposed self-deterministic legitimacy for its annexation by the Russian Federation in March of this year. Thereafter, the Kremlin launched its Novorossiya project that largely floundered beyond some heartland areas until the decisive recent intervention of Russian heavy armor in the Donbass basin. Ukraine has now joined Georgia and Moldova in having portions of its de jure territory turned into pro-Russian de facto states beyond its practical writ and control. Now, tomorrow, Scotland votes on whether to leave the United Kingdom and become an independent state. Catalonia seeks independence from Spain and will this Friday try again to place a referendum for independence on the ballot for a 9th of November vote. Milorad Dodik, who is currently in Moscow, has long held out the possibility that there will be a referendum in Republika Srpska on the independence of that entity from Bosnia. It will happen all of a sudden, quote unquote, he told a reporter from Newsweek in April of this year. So, is a new separatist, self-determinist wave about to be launched tomorrow from the British Isles? Perhaps, perhaps not. What we can say today is that a statue of Gavrilo Princip, a young idealist, turned assassin who killed a pregnant woman and a prominent pregnant woman and her husband. A statue of Princip overshadowing a playground in Bosnia does not bode well for the future. Not simply of Bosnia, I think for humanity writ large. Hobson remarked in his book that the third millennium, quote, will almost certainly continue to be one of violent politics and violent political changes. The only thing uncertain about them is where they will lead, end quote.
Excellent.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. I would like to express my gratitude to our gracious hosts, the Library of Congress, for all the time and energy they have invested in making this event so successful. Professor Miller, Professor Toal, Mrs. Cartwright, your efforts are much appreciated. We look forward with great enthusiasm to the library's publication of the First World War in 2016. Ambassador Klein, it's great to have you here. Thank you for taking part. Thank you also thanks also to Center for Transatlantic Relations, the America-Bosnian Foundation, and to you, Ambassador Simonyi, for your dedicated advocacy on behalf of my country and the entire Balkan region. We here heard a discussion of a tragic event and its long-lasting consequences through the 20th century until today. In many ways, we are still feeling the aftershocks of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914, which our distinguished panel considered in detail. But I'm here to tell you that in spite of the difficulties of the 20th century, the future is bright for my country and the Balkan region. Thanks in great part for the support and our friends of the United States. Peace has come to Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Balkans. Our neighbor and friend, Croatia, joined the European Union last year, and we, Bosnians and Herzegovinians, are united by desire to join them. With a young, hardworking, and gifted population, we are ready to meet the challenges that lay in our path. In many ways, the world we know began in Sarajevo in 1914. As we listen to the discussion of a past full of war and conflict in the old continent and beyond, I hope it will unite us further in desire for a present and a future full of peace and mutual understanding and respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much. So the floor is open, and I'm sure you have questions about the past, present, future.
Hi, my name is Alexander Palmer from the National Democratic Institute. My question is actually for Professor Toal. Given that in 5 years we'll have the 100th anniversary of the Paris Peace Conference, I was wondering your thoughts on the impact that Isaiah Bowman and Woodrow Wilson's Little Black Book had on the Europe that we saw immediately after World War I, as well as the Europe that we see today, and a little bit more specifically as to how their geopolitical molding can be seen today in the boundaries that we currently have and the geopolitical situation that we currently see.
Great question. Professor?
Well, I don't know that I can really answer that. It's not something that's a specialization of mine. Obviously, Neil Smith's biography of Isaiah Bowman is the kind of standard and classic work, American Empire. I do think, however, that one general principle to keep in mind, and I think this was partly the theme of Professor Miller's presentation too, is that we shouldn't point to particular individuals as having an inordinate influence on the events. In this case, Bowman and his whole kind of inquiry project and for those of you that are unfamiliar with this, this is a particular, Isaiah Bowman was the chair of the American Geographic Society. He was a key advisor to Woodrow Wilson and later to FDR. He was someone who helped establish the Council on Foreign Relations. He was an editor of the Foreign Affairs that helped establish that particular journal. And he created what was, in one sense, a mobile CIA archive, which went with Woodrow Wilson to Paris, to Versailles, to try to inform the deliberations that were taking place there in the boundary drawing. He subsequently wrote a book called The New World in the 1920s, I believe, a kind of standard text, political geographic text. He was the most significant political geographer, I think, in American life that most people probably haven't heard of. But I don't think that he was so influential necessarily. Certainly, I haven't looked at or seen kind of comparative analysis of the intelligence that the Americans had vis-a-vis the boundaries and the boundary drawing process relative to others. But my understanding of it in broad terms of the Vienna or of the Versailles peace negotiations, perhaps Paul could talk to this, is that the Americans didn't get their way in many instances, and that they were ignored by the European powers and their particular interests and their particular kind of dogged pursuit of their ends. So in that sense, it wasn't an American. I don't think you can say it was an American-shaped world, but it's a very good question.
Yeah, I said I thought that was a fair assessment. It's Margaret Macmillan, who I quoted and criticized her quote, used it sort of as the thread in my short piece. Not short enough, but nonetheless. That she wrote a major work on 1919 and to bring things to Yugoslavia and the Peace of Paris, which is a great read. She's a great narrative writer, and I'm reading her book on the origins of World War I right now and getting a lot out of it, though it's not really paradigm shifting in any way. It's a great narrative. But the point is she has a chapter on Yugoslavia, and to bring things back to Yugoslavia, she makes a statement that its origins in World War I were problematic to begin with, and she even goes so far as to saying that it kind of was foresaw what was to come, and I don't agree with that part. And I want to emphasize this. I think that the way in which Yugoslavia came together in war, yeah, it was certainly hastened into existence, so to say, by the collapse of the empire and the successes of the regrouped Serbian army. Nonetheless, it could well have worked. There's lots of different paths in history that one could march down, and so I didn't want to sound exclusionist in that sense. But as to America shaping the world in Versailles, yes, clearly, from what I understand in the historiography, though by no means is it my specialty, Woodrow Wilson, who marched into Paris, Vive Wilson, and as the great hero, and obviously after the destruction of World War I, people wanted to make it worth something. Right, reshape the world in some sort of better order, that he had to compromise significantly with Clemenceau, with Lloyd George, and with the others, and the idea of self-determination of peoples is probably also very relevant to Professor Toal's talk, which in the context of, I also was going to mention Scotland, but didn't quite get there. This is an interesting idea because there are differences too today. I think that we have to keep in mind the EU makes a significant difference when we talk about nations wanting some sort of sovereignty and the possibilities of Bosnia not working out and the entities, et cetera, et cetera. There is a larger context today to be considered rather than simply national kind of, thumping of your particular group's greatness or something like that. But in any case, that's all I have to say on Versailles.
It always struck me as odd, looking at a map of Europe after World War I, how one could rationally do the kinds of things they did. How could you leave, basically, Hungarians in Slovakia, Siebenbürger Germans in Romania, Germans in the Banat, Volksdeutsche in Poland, Ukrainians in Poland. I mean, if you're talking about national self-determination, when you look at a map of Europe, demographically, and you superimpose these minorities, Volksdeutsche in Yugoslavia, and you superimpose them, it escapes all rational logic. And for statesmen to have sat there and said, oh yes, this is fine. These Germans will be very happy in a Czechoslovakia. These Ukrainians will be very happy in a new Poland. These Germans will be happy in a Banat, or as I said, the Siebenburgers, or wherever else you want to stick them. That always baffled me. The rationale of that, because you knew it bodes nothing but trouble, ultimately.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm Joe Foley with the National Federation of Croatian Americans. And while Professor Miller may have answered some of this question already, I'd like to pose it to him, and I want to thank the panelists' excellent scholarship today here at the Library of Congress. Professor Miller, what are your historical views of the Yugoslavist movement assessment today in the Balkans, positive and negative?
Well, I guess I would have to be, that's a great question, and I, in the context of my talk, should have said much more about Yugoslavism. It has roots that go, the Yugoslav idea, Yugoslavism, the idea of a South Slavic state goes back to the early 19th century at least. The Illyrian movement is usually the origins, and it does pick up a great deal of steam during World War I. There's an exhibition that takes place in Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and there are publications about Yugoslavism, so people begin seeing the possibilities in a much more serious sense during the war itself. But as for today, well, that breaks down by political orientation, clearly. And a lot of people see, certainly many Serbs on the right from what I've read, and I'm not active in the region in dealing with contemporary issues and political issues. There's a sense that this was a bankrupt idea from the beginning, and that this led to the repression of Serbs within a greater Yugoslavia. And then, of course, there's the inevitability people, and that's what I also criticize severely, the idea that it never would have worked. I don't agree with that at all. I think the conditions that brought Yugoslavia into existence did not necessarily, as problematic as they were, mean that it was doomed somehow. But today, in terms of the general atmosphere and environment, there's Yugo nostalgia for the Tito period for obvious reasons. But in terms of constructing a national identity based on South Slavic identity, my sense is that people have more of their narrower ethno-national concerns to focus on today than reviving ideas that seem to have now sort of made it into the past. And the goal is this supranational unit, which is, of course, the European Union. And it's important to remember, when you talked about, will Germans be happy in the Banat and things like that? The people in Paris weren't talking about the happiness of these people. They
cared less.
Sorry?
They could have cared less.
Yeah, exactly. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a functional state, and the historiography that's been done on it since the 80s, I mean, prior to the early 1980s, it was always this decrepit a monarchy that was part of the past, and it was going to break apart along national lines, and it fought 4 years before it broke up. The Russians didn't make it that long. It existed, it lasted, it held together during the entire war, and this has been commented upon by several historians. And the new scholarship focuses on things like language frontiers and military veterans organizations and cultural events, and shows the interactions between Czechs and Germans in what's today Western Czech Republic. And it says, wait a second, the national mobilization that was taking place was done by political elites, but when you look at ordinary people, things function. And this was, the analogy has been made, and it's problematic as most of these historical analogies, but this was an open economic area, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You can move from one linguistic region to the next, and it's the same currency, right? So all of these people were so-called trapped in an empire with a Austrian, Habsburg ruler, in which Germans were only about 24% of the entire ethnic Germans, including Austrians, 24% of the total, approximately. Hungarians, 1 or 2% less than that, and Slavs more than the two of them together when you add all of these Slavic peoples together. This was a complex place. And it functioned for a long time. And there's nothing to say, too, that had Germany won and Germany and Austria-Hungary won World War I, which they almost did, it would have existed, it would have gone on. And maybe the ideals of Gavrilo Princip would have been reached in a more independent Bosnia and Herzegovina within a larger Central European empire. We have no way of knowing. But that's a deviation from your question. I hope not too badly.
That was great. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. I'd like to, okay, one more question, and then I'd like the panelists to each comment, and then we will need to wrap it up. But please, sir.
Obred Kesic from the Office of the Republika Srpska here in D.C. My question is to Professor Miller. I wonder if you could extend the analysis or perhaps the comparison that's being made recently over the course of this anniversary of the beginning of the war, the parallels between Austria-Hungary and Yugoslavia in terms of, do you see that as a historically something that can be compared? Do you see something, especially in terms of the minorities and kind of the weaknesses of the state?
Well, that's an interesting question. Thank you very much. And I'm going to have to strain to answer it perhaps to your satisfaction. I know, however, that that is something that was discussed in the socialist period, that we are very much the replacement state of Austria-Hungary was part of the rhetoric at that time. And I think that what you're getting at and what I'm kind of getting at and what we're all getting at as part of this panel is the World War was a tragedy on lots of different levels. I mean, first of all, 10 million young people died. All right, 1.5 million Armenians, and then all the consequences that come out of the Great War. And yet at another level, we look back with a certain amount of nostalgia, of course, on these multinational empires. They were far from perfect, but they were, if we track them across the long durée, moving in a secular, democratic direction that was allowing more of a political voice for minorities. And whether Yugoslavia, on a smaller scale, because its minorities were mainly, there were less of the various national minorities, but nonetheless very well distributed, but less so. There was still a kind of dominant Serb core, even though they weren't 50% quite, I don't think. No, right? I'm correct. But there was more of a dominant core, just like you had in the Russian Empire, in the European part of the Russian Empire. You had a dominant kind of core group, and that was not the case at all in Austria-Hungary. I mean, ethnic Germans, as I said, were in the 20 percentiles. So I mean, I think that if we look forward, we look back on these multinational states now with a certain kind of what-if nostalgia because of our efforts to open up borders, clearly, especially for peoples in the Balkans. I think it's important, and open up economic opportunities. And those were there in an earlier era in a different kind of way.
Jacques?
Well, looking back, I was just going to say, it's interesting, Strossmayer and those people tried very hard to come up with this concept of a Slavism. It didn't work. The one thing Strossmayer, by the way, deserves credit for, I think he was the only cardinal who voted against papal infallibility. So he does deserve credit for some other things as well. But the point is, if you look at France and Germany, who fought for 300 years, as long as there were 16 million Frenchmen and 6.5 million Germans, and the French state was centralized, they beat the hell out of the Germans. And all those castles, Heidelberg, Ramstein, etc., were blown up by French engineers. Once the Germans achieved population supremacy, industrialization, and also centralization, then they were able to take on the French. But ultimately, they had to say to themselves, what exactly are we fighting for here? World War I, were the Germans after colonies? Well, they lost what little they had. But what was it all about? And I think it took them a long time. Now, let's hope it doesn't take 300 years in the Balkans for people to realize that this is all a futile effort with endless heartache and bloodshed and loss of largesse and revenue and what have you. So it can be done. It takes time. It takes a lot of statesmanship, which also didn't exist in World War I. We had very few real statesmen when Europe stumbled into World War I to really make a difference. The Talleyrand's, the Metternichs, people of that sort. So I think it can be done. It's just going to take time. And it should be easier than it was between France and Germany. All of you know there's a vast difference between French, Latin, Romance, culture, and Germanic, Teutonic, Saxon culture, the languages, the history, the traditions, yet ultimately then between Serb, Croat, Bosniak, or whomever, Slovenian, whoever you want to throw in there, Slovaks as well. But the point is, it should be a lot easier. Fundamental same base in language, et cetera, et cetera. Even though the religions are different, still, they're Christian religions except for the small Muslim minority. So I think it can be done, but it takes an enormous amount of goodwill. It's hard to forget, though. And that's the thing that I really fear. It's not what they say in public. It's what I've heard them say in private that worries me. What's said at the dinner table? Who was killed by whom? Who injured whom?
There's still a lot of PTSD.
That's what I really worry about. You know, when I hear stories like when people are taking a census and they say, well, who lived there? And I say, you should know you killed them. And that's not that long ago. So that's what's going to be, I think, the harder, the human dimension. And unfortunately, I'm afraid the children are not necessarily exposed to the positive. They're exposed to the most negative at the dinner table. And that's, I think, fundamentally the real problem. How do we get over that? Education, tolerance, learning, etc. Now, I'm a great believer in the economy. Let me digress for a minute. If you take the Swiss, French Calvinists, and German Catholic Swiss, and Italian Catholic Swiss, and Romansh are very, very different, totally culturally. But they long ago decided it's not worth killing each other, or whether you're an Anabaptist and I'm a Catholic. I don't know who the hell the president of Switzerland is. No one cares. I don't know who the foreign minister is. Our goal is to create an economy that profits all of us. And what they have done intelligently is kind of driven government down to the locus level, the canton. In Switzerland, the canton, or even the city, Zurich, Geneva, can make you a Swiss citizen. And maybe that's the way, this devolution of power to a much more slower level. And then with trade, commerce, time, majority rule, minority rights, you may be able to make some progress.
Thank you. Professor, would you like to say a few concluding remarks?
Concluding remarks. Okay. Well, let me actually put on my Irish hat here, and I'm not going to tell a joke, but I'm going to talk about the larger context, the larger sort of arc. Last year, the Queen visited Ireland for the first time. And this year, the Irish president was part of the ceremony marking the outbreak of World War I in France. It has taken a long, long time, an awful long time, for the Republic of Ireland to come to terms with the fact that thousands upon thousands of its own men went to fight for the British Empire and fought and died horribly on the Somme and other fields in France. They fought not for Irish independence, they fought for the British Empire. But those same men who were fighting were also often people who supported Irish independence or supported Irish home rule and Irish autonomy within the British Empire of the time. But they were sort of an embarrassment because the princeps of Ireland, the young heroes, the idealists, took over the General Post Office in 1916 and started a rebellion which led to a wave of nationalism, the rise of Sinn Féin in Ireland, and then a very bloody war of independence, followed by a very nasty civil war. That created a so-called free state in the Republic of Ireland, which was free of the British Empire by and large by 1922. But that came at a cost, and the cost was in part denying Ireland's full history and denying the complexities and the ambiguities of that history and not treating that in a way which was sufficiently mature to recognize that with national pride comes also recognition of your national weaknesses and your national failures and things that are embarrassing about your society. There's lots of things which are very, very embarrassing about Irish nationalism and about what happened during the War of Independence and afterwards. And some of those things are only now being discussed. So all of this is to say that what we see in Bosnia right now, the kind of tremendous difficulties that that state has had over the last 20, 30 years, are human difficulties. They are difficulties that states have had historically, all different peoples, and we should kind of refrain from overly sort of demonizing any particular group in Bosnia or any particular sort of practice in Bosnia, because those practices are often practices we find throughout human history in lots of different places.
Excellent. Jacques, we really have to wrap it up.
Sure.
Please
And
keep it short, please.
People do change. You all remember that the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha suddenly, when World War I became the House of Windsor. And Prince Louis Mountbatten, the first Sea Lord of the British Empire, very quickly changed his name to Louis Mountbatten from Battenberg. And one of the few humorous things that Kaiser Wilhelm ever said was, he said, perhaps we should change Shakespeare's Merry Wives of Windsor to the Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha.
Well, thank you very much. I don't think we could have had a better final comment than Professor Toal's. But I'd love to see all the three of you go to Budapest and give the same speech. I'd like to thank Professor Miller, Ambassador Klein, and Professor Toal for an excellent lecture and a good discussion. I appreciate you all coming, and I think there are drinks and food served, and you can all grill the professors while you drink. I think it's Hungarian champagne. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.